Write the equation of the cosine curve. All right, before we try to come up with an equation, let's try to remember what cosine looks like. Cosine, give or take, is going to be starting at 1 and then coming down and repeating itself at 2 pi. What I need to do is I need to take a look at this and see how this differs from the regular cosine curve. What I see right off the bat is, first things first, I am not centered at the x-axis. I am moved down, looks like 1 whole unit. Also, things are kind of like squeezed a little bit, and my period is different. So I'm looking at 3 things that are off. Okay, so let's take a look at thing number 1. Thing number 1 is my amplitude. That's probably the easiest thing to look at. My amplitude is going to be the highest point minus the lowest point, and then take that guy and divide that by 2. Now, my highest point appears to be at -1/2, and then my lowest point appears to be at -1.5, which means the difference between -1/2 and -1.5 is 1 full unit. Does that mean my amplitude is 1? No. My amplitude is going to be half of that. So half of 1, let me get out my calculator, is a half. So that's going to be my amplitude. That's thing number 1 that I need to focus on. Thing number 2, probably the other easy thing, quote unquote easy thing, is to figure out where my midline is. What my midline does is that gives me the vertical shift. Now, my midline is literally me taking a line and cutting my cosine in half. Now, that appears to happen right around here. Now, what my midline does is my midline tells me where my vertical shift is. Okay, so my vertical shift, and I'll write this out as VS just because I don't have all the space in the world, has me moving down 1. Okay, or I'll write this out as a vertical shift of -1. How will that affect my cosine function? Well, after I do all of my cosine stuff and the things attached to cosine, I'm just going to subtract 1 to it, and that takes the whole thing and moves it down 1. Okay, so that's going to be my vertical shift. Last thing is, since my cosine kind of started out, my peak was where it should be, I don't have a phase shift or a horizontal shift, so thank God I don't have to worry about that. However, what I do have to worry about is my period. Now, my graph is supposed to repeat every half or every 2 pi. That doesn't happen here. My period is every 1 pi. So if your period is every pi, period is also given to you by figuring out what your frequency is. Now, frequency, when written out, is the number attached to x. The way you find out what your frequency is you take your period and you do, and I like to call, by the way, I like to call my frequency B. It's going to be 2 pi divided by the period. The period is pi. So this is going to be 2 pi divided by pi. Pi's cancel out. So my B, or my frequency, is just going to be 2. Okay, so let's write all of this out now that we know what we know. Okay, Y equals, my amplitude is going to be the number in front of cosine attached to cosine, and my amplitude was a half. Cosine is cosine. My number attached to x is going to be my period. So, I'm sorry, my frequency. So my frequency gives me 2x. And then since this is bumped down to 1 unit, since the midline is at -1, I'm subtracting 1 from this whole thing right here. So that's my cos function. When we deal with phase shifts and horizontal shifts, things change and it makes things a whole lot messier, but thankfully we didn't have to deal with that here. Just the other 3, dunzo.